My roommates know that I do this show, and they think it's a little bit weird, but considering what some of them do for fun around here, this isn't so bad. So it really came as no surprise to me when one of my roommates handed me a thumbnail drive and said, "Here, check this out, you might like it." Yeah, he made me feel really ancient. I don't get why modern kids are attracted to ancient video games. When you hold Atari's Combat up against World of Tanks, there's no comparison. Tanks is much more realistic, the controls are better, the gameplay is slicker, and seeing a tank explode, much more rewarding. And yet, if I sit a modern gamer down with an Atari 2600 and Combat, they're not only going to play it, they're going to be fascinated enough to stick with it. For that matter, old video games seem to have that effect just in general. When Google's Pac-Man Doodle was released, I can't tell you how many kids rediscovered the glory that is Pac-Man, and speaking of the thing, Pac-Man has the strangest shrine that I've ever seen. There's a Flash website where people design maps and then link them together to be one continuous experience. And here's where I pull out the rocking chair and scream, "Get off my lawn!" because this made me feel ancient. To suddenly realize that the entire Atari, Nintendo, and Sega Genesis library fits on this, yeah, that made me feel kind of ancient. Okay, so the ROMs are the same, so it's the exact same game that I played as a kid. Is it the same experience? Not really. I really should start with some definitions so we're all on the same page. Old video game systems, Atari 2600, Nintendo, Sega, they're archaic, we know this. If you want to play one of these games, you have to actually find the box, and the way that you do that is you go raid Craigslist, eBay, garage sales, used game dealers, just so you can actually find the machines. Or you can find programs online which pretend to be the old systems, and these are appropriately enough called emulators. Now, in order to play these games, you have to actually find the cartridges, and again, you can raid stores, and that's always a fun option. Believe me, you can spend hours. Or you can download ROMs and ISOs. ROM stands for read-only memory, and it's how the old video games worked. Inside the cartridge, there's a board, and the programming is hardwired onto the board in the cartridge. Now, if you're going to go buy an arcade classic on something like Xbox Live or similar, you're not really buying the original. From all I've seen and experienced, you're getting a modern, revamped version for a new audience. It's kind of like looking at a World War II airplane that has a jet engine and digital gauges inside of it. Yeah, on the outside it looks the same, but not the same when you get into it. It could be argued that the ROMs you find online and such are the pure game, but even here, I'm going to argue against that. Mostly because you're missing out on a lot of what made those games interesting, and I'm going to start with this Atari emulator. Now, when you're watching me play Pitfall here, it looks pretty normal, but let me swap to the main camera. You see, because I'm doing this on a keyboard, and that gives me a lot more fine control than I ever had back in the day. If you really want an immersive experience, you want to know what we suffered through, you got to get yourself an Atari joystick. The classic Atari joystick had only 4 direction buttons, and the skill of playing the game sometimes came down to finessing the stick so you can get your character to go where you needed it to go. Not to mention that the controller itself was so large you could torque the hell out of the parts inside of it. That's why modern controllers have really small joysticks. There's also processing power issues. A lot of the emulators of modern machines run way too fast and smooth. The Atari was pretty smooth at the time, but not this good. At the risk of sounding like a snob, this is really where the difference is. Because, yeah, sure, the ROM is the same, it's the same program, but how you interact with it makes all the difference in the world. And at this point I would love to wax nostalgic, talk about the old Intellivision discs, the old Atari joysticks and all of that, but I really would like to save that for a completely different time. I would rather answer one question. Are emulators a bad thing? Actually, no. Emulators serve a purpose in that they preserve our gaming history. To give one example, the game you're looking at right now. Never seen it before? Not surprised, there's only about 300,000 copies that exist. It's a game called Uniracers, and I'll admit, it's one of my favorite games of all times. It's a pure racing game. No leveling, no buying up power, just skill-based racing. Now, this game came out in 1994 from DMA and Nintendo, and shortly after its release, DMA was sued by Pixar. Yeah, that Pixar. Allegedly, DMA copied Pixar's unicycle character from a 1987 short film called Red's Dream, and since Pixar has better lawyers, they proved that they own the rights to any computer-animated unicycle. End result, the game ceased production in spite of its success. Now, thing is, I really want to sit designers down and make them play this game so they can learn what can be done with a simple racing game. The action is fast, the tracks are challenging, there's simple color systems so you can anticipate what's coming up, and there's a trick mechanic for speed boosts that just fits perfectly. Nothing extraneous, pure racing. But the only way to play this is to either find a Super Nintendo that actually works and the game cartridge for Uniracers, or on an emulator. And given the fact that the physical game itself isn't common to find, that leaves the emulators.
One thing before I move on, playing games like Uniracers and pretty much everything from the Super Nintendo generation onward, you can't play it on a keyboard. There's way too many buttons on the controller to try to do on the keys. It's just impossible. Trust me, I've tried. But we'll talk about these in a future episode. But there's something else I want to talk about with the emulators, ISOs, ROMs, all that other stuff. They may not be 100% legal.
In the United States of America, they are not legal by book law. In 1983, a court case of Atari versus JSNA, the court system stated that the ROMs didn't fall into the same legal category as magnetic media when it came to backups. So, by book law, you can't make an archival copy of a game you've purchased. Legally speaking, you could make a good case either way, but keep in mind that Atari has sold ROMs for the main arcade emulators, so they still own the properties and they still maintain them. ISOs, very questionable as well, and someday I figure it's going to make a really interesting court case.
And before people start screaming at me about it, look, it's the law. Get off your high horse. This is just how the law is worded. I understand. It's impossible to find some of these old games on cartridges, let alone find a working Atari 2600, let alone find the working joystick and or paddles to make it work, let alone trying to figure out how to hook it up to a modern TV, let alone that some of these companies are not even re-releasing their old titles and burying them because, oh, those are inferior products, we're just going to deny those ever existed. And there's also the moral questions of, is it okay to pirate something if there's no other way to get it? But way too many tangents. Way too many tangents. Let's kind of stick to focus here. Let's answer one other question. Why is this even a thing?
It's an honest question. Why would any modern gamer want to pick up an ancient Atari game and play it? Why play Pitfall when you can play Bioshock? Why would you play Doom when you've got Halo 4? Why play a text game like Zork when you've got World of Warcraft? In a way, I think it's several things. Modern games deliver on graphics and story, but not a lot on gameplay. Skyrim is basically the same game as Adventure, with better dragons and a bigger world. I think there's something to the old gameplay that's still challenging, or at least different than the modern games. I think there's also a retro charm to the old games too. It's hard to take them in context since we've been kind of bombarded with video game genres, but these old games were groundbreaking. We had kind of this innocence to these games because everything that they did was new. They could experiment with weird concepts just to see what worked. They created the conventions that we take for granted, and the old games, they're still kind of challenging to play.
To quote the Bard once again, what's past is prologue. Or a better way to put this in a modern sense, you can't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. So even though I'm not one to condone illegal activities, I'm very much a fan of emulators, and I think that it's more important to preserve our history than it is to preserve copyright law. But that being said, you're missing out on a whole lot of the context of the experience if you're playing an emulator, and I don't know if there's really a way that you can get it back. Looking at the old games through the modern lens, you're missing a lot in the translation. You're missing the era, you're missing the interface, you're missing the old CRT television sets we used to play on. I'm just saying, it's not the same thing. Damn kids!